Welcome to a Prevent Connect podcast, where we explore the prevention of violence against women. This is a project of the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault.
How y'all doing? I feel like this back table is doing real well over there. I'm getting a sense. So nice to be here with you all. It is such an honor to be at this conference and to be in this room with such amazing colleagues and friends doing such incredible work. So thank you for taking the time to be here on the last day of the conference. Today we are talking about all of the behind the scenes and somewhat maybe invisible work that we do as prevention folks and educators. And while there's maybe a lot of examples of those, today we're gonna really focus on how do we build partnerships in our communities and in our spaces. How do we then adapt content to make it very relevant for all the different communities and micro communities in which we work? And then how do we assess whether or not our partnerships and how we adapted or tailored a training actually made a difference? And so my name is Melissa Tumis. I am from the great state of Michigan, Detroit, Michigan, right here. Detroit, Dearborn, Michigan, and I live in Seattle now and have lived in Seattle now for about 14 years. So got my, very full Pacific Northwest, but my heart, of course, is always with my friends in the Midwest. So I came to this work when I was a college student at Michigan State, and I was a theater kid, and I was introduced to this idea of educational theater, where we used theater to teach important topics around sexual health. And through my experience and in college, I was able to really learn these concepts of privilege and power and difference and systems of oppression and health promotion and kind of all these things that were happening. And it really kind of helped me articulate and gave me some vocabulary on what had been bothering me all these years, and sort of the world started to make sense to me, and it helped me give voice to my own experiences and the experiences of my friends. And so I think I work in universities and colleges because I come from, that was such a formative time for me as a student. And so I have worked in a few other areas besides sexual assault and relationship violence prevention. So I worked in HIV prevention for a bit. I worked in health literacy at a hospital, children's hospital, but have worked at a few different schools around the country. So at the University of Washington in Seattle, my main focus, my main role is providing prevention and education for all students. And my background is as an advocate as well, so I feel like that is the heart of what I do in centering survivors, and my passion is really in prevention. So, and I don't know, something weird about something quirky about me. I have a lot of things that are very quirky about me, but we need to know each other a little bit better before we go into that. But I don't know, maybe I've been a vegetarian for 20 years-ish. Well, pesca. In the Pacific Northwest, we eat a lot of fish. So that's something sort of quirky.
Morning, folks, and I'm Kiana Swearingen, and I am the Training Communications Specialist for a violence prevention program at the University of Washington. It's really unique. We have this amazing program that serves students, staff, and faculty at UW, and my primary role at UW is providing prevention, education, and kind of conversation spaces for staff and faculty around how to prevent violence for themselves, for their peers, and for students. And that includes Melissa and I co-lead the bystander education efforts on our campus as well. Before coming to UW, I worked at a community-based domestic violence agency for over 10 years. I worked in a confidential location for a lot of that, and then I also worked as a prevention educator in middle schools for 3 years, conducting long-term healthy relationship classes with folks who had been identified as using abusive behaviors or experiencing abusive behaviors themselves. Some other fun things about me, I grew up in very rural Alaska. I grew up without running water and without electricity, and I now live in Seattle. I've been there for 12 years, but as I live in Seattle, I've kind of made a little bit of Alaska there for myself, and one of the ways I do that is, we get snow twice a year, not at all, and it's maybe so little on the ground, but my son and I are determined every time it snows to make a snowman 2 times taller than us. So that's why I want to put that picture up for you, because I'm we have to pretend we're in Alaska for one day. So that's my son and my daughter. And the reason I put them up there is I think that there are so many ways that we are all connected to this work. And sometimes it's good to check back in with how we're connected. And one of the ways that I'm really connected is that I care a lot about my university community, I care a lot about you and the work that you're doing, but I also care a lot about the future that we're all creating together. And my kids take me back to that place daily, and they inspire me, and so I wanted you to know a little bit about them as well. So thank you for being here with us today.
So the objectives. Again, we're going to start off with just giving you a bit of a snapshot of the prevention landscape at the University of Washington, just to give you a sense of kind of the community in which we're working. And then we're going to really share kind of our strategies and lessons learned around how we built partnerships, how we adapt content, and all along the way, we're going to give you time to discuss in pairs about how this relates to you and the community that you're working in. So we're going to give people space to sort of let this ruminate and think about this a little bit more so that you can leave with sort of a blueprint of how this might work for your spaces. And we know that each community and school and university are really in different places as far as your level of institutional buy-in or resources or staffing and whatever that looks like for you. And so this is really intended to be useful for wherever you're at in that kind of spectrum of a lot of student buy-in and activism or a lot of community buy-in or maybe not as much. And so the intention is to have this be useful no matter where you're at. And again, we're all working under increased demand and not as many resources and staffing that we all need. So we're also giving you some tools that you can hopefully use quickly and when on short timing. And again, hope this to be useful for you.
Another kind of thing we want to hold on today is our goal together. And so part of that is this idea of making visible the essential aspects of what we do, the prevention, the education, and advocacy that go on behind the scenes while we work under increased pressure with limited resources, as Melissa was saying, right? And the challenge here is that much of the work that we do is not the things that check boxes for grants and funders. It is incredibly hard work we do around the things that people see, right? What they see is this tiny slice, and there's been a history of all of our other work being ignored. And so today we want you to also be able to help build a case for why that work is vital and why you might need to put other things aside and put them away for a little while to focus more on the work we do all around. And so we're going to talk a lot about that. And what we found was some great inspiration on a Wednesday morning, because Tarana said, this work has been elevated and invisibilized, right? And I was like, yes, thank you, exactly. And I hope we all were like, yes, when you heard that. Because it has been recognized as vital and important, and yet it is not being seen for how much work it takes and the value and the professionalism we bring, right? The things we bring to the table are not being acknowledged, and it sure isn't being funded, right? And so we want to acknowledge that today, and we want to think about what we as a movement, what we as preventionists can do because of that, with our work being invisibilized. So what we would like for you all to do now is get the chance to have a little conversation. We want to think a little bit about, as preventionists, what vital parts of your work with communities are invisible, right? What are folks not asking you about, not seeing, not acknowledging, you're not being recognized for? And this is a thing we don't get to talk a lot about, we don't get to think about, and so we really want to give you all some space to talk about this morning. So if you would break into pairs as you feel able and comfortable to engage with others, please look around and make sure no one gets left out, and then discuss this for about 5 minutes, and then we're going to come back and check in a little bit. So discuss amongst yourselves what parts of your, vital parts of your work with communities has been made invisible. Thanks, everyone. So we would love to have a few folks share in. We would love to have a few folks share in as you feel comfortable, just some of the things that you feel are not seen and are made invisible in the work that you do. And I'm going to bring the mic to folks. So, yeah.
We kind of talked about in terms of being collaborative and partnerships, it's a lot of that work becomes invisible in terms of maintaining those partnerships, whether that's not, you might not be connecting with them about the prevention work, but you're connecting with them, how's your day, how's it going, to maintain those relationships and those partnerships. And I feel like that becomes invisible because people think you already have established that relationship and it's there forever, and that's not true. It's like our work of being collaborative and keeping these partnerships going takes day-to-day, monthly, weekly, yearly connections.
Thank you so much. We are absolutely going to talk about that later, this idea of sustaining. What does sustaining our work look like, right? Other folks? Who else would like to share? What else they feel has been made invisible?
Well, we talked about being like a clinician / advocate and also in the prevention space, so having the secondary trauma be invisible.
Yeah.
That we're
Yes.
carrying. Yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely, thank you. And the space to care for yourself, right? Anyone else? What else did y'all think came up with when you thought about what has been made invisible in your work?
As a funder, the procurement piece is incredibly invisible, and trying to get the communication out to eligible colleges and universities that there's funding available, it can be really challenging to get a nice competitive pool of applicants.
Okay, we have a funder in the room, everybody.
We will make a bubble of
We'll help
safety
you.
for you as you leave.
We'll help share that message.
Yeah, this idea of kind of our relationships with folks. Was there another? Oh, yeah. Thank you for calling me back.
Good morning. So we discussed at our table, I'm a military victim advocate, and so in my field, when we're working with a survivor and the adjudication process is finished and maybe it's not the result that the survivor wanted, we have to sit with them with that, bring that back to them, and that process can take a year. We're caring for them long after the adjudication is over, and that's something that's definitely not recognized because the lawyers think, okay, the case is done, but no, this survivor has to live with this, and we go through that with them. So we discussed that.
Right, that long-term relationship and care we provide to so many folks, right? Whether it's folks that we are working with or whether it is partnering agencies we have, right? That is one of the key things we feel has been really not acknowledged and seen. So the question that we want for you all to think a little bit about is what can we do about that, right? How can we as a community think about this problem of some parts of our work not being acknowledged and do something different? How can we rally around that? How can we support each other? How can we make that be seen, right? What are our strategies? And so we're going to kind of bring this thread through today.
So again, just to kind of briefly share with you the community in which we work and the prevention landscape. So the University of Washington is a large public research institution, and we have 3 campuses. So the largest campus in Seattle, in which we're both located, and then there's 2 other campuses in adjacent cities in Tacoma and Bothell. And we have a total combination of all those campuses of around 41,000 undergraduate students, 16,000 graduate students, and then 45,000 employees. And so we often kind of joke that we're sort of a little city unto ourselves in the city of Seattle, which really is not that big of a city at 700,000 people who live in the city of Seattle. So we do climate surveys with our students. We've been doing them since 2011. And I'm not going to share kind of course, all the data with you. I'm just going to share a little bit about students' access to education and what they're getting or not getting. This past year we did, in 2016 was the last climate survey we did, and we used the ARC3 survey tool, which I highly recommend as a tool that's free, as well as was created by an amazing coalition of students and advocates and legal professionals and researchers. And we found through our survey that since attending University of Washington, UW as we call it, that 26% of students, only 26% of students have ever attended any sort of educational program or event around sexual assault prevention. 35% of students, or 36, had received any type of education before they came to UW, and that while they're at UW, 49% received any type of written information about this topic or definitions. And we know that our president sends all campus emails a few times a year. We know that they get some written information and orientation, but again, some of that is either not getting to them, not getting in their hands. And yet we see 80% of students are saying they saw a poster at some point or another about sexual assault at UW, which has sort of increased my faith in postering a little bit, I will say, but also I think, of course, is not the intensive education that we're hoping for. So with, we have a few things cut off there. So at UW, we have undergone 2 presidential appointed task forces since I've been there that have reviewed our sexual assault response policies and services, as well as our prevention services. And those 2, when those task force happened, they were really incredible campus-wide events. So Kayena's office was created as a result of one of them. My position at UW was created as a result of one of them. But both of those task forces then ended. And so our Title IX office is now leading a larger strategic planning effort to look at comprehensive education at the university. So we're both on that committee, and I'm really hopeful and excited that finally we can move towards having a more comprehensive plan. But to be really honest, this is the community we're working in. We're not working under a comprehensive plan right now. And so we're moving towards that, and we're excited, but it's not yet there. And so what students get at UW, so first year transfer and international students all go through orientation. So it's about like 97% of students go through this orientation. So they take an online module before they get to campus. Once they're on campus, they do an in-person session where we talk about a variety of health and wellness issues. So we talk about mental health, alcohol and other drugs, relationships, consent, and sexual assault and relationship violence prevention. It's a short session, it's a half hour. For all those topics. And then students in freshman interest groups or like first year student homerooms get exposed to some of this education. So right now we have our peer health educators leading a mental health workshop for that space. There are some groups on campus who have required mandatory programming. So that is all of our athletic teams as well as our Greek chapters. And the Greek chapters, it's really only the ones that are in a recognition agreement with the university. So interfraternity IFC and Panhellenic are the fraternities that have housing on campus. So the other United Greek Council, so fraternities and sororities that are either Latino or Asian interests, or the historically black fraternities and sororities are not do not have those requirements, although that is actually changing. They're moving into they're considering sort of being part of the recognition agreement. Let me just finish real quick one sec. Yeah, thank you. And then we have the folks on campus who provide the education. And so we're always kind of running around to provide education and meet the need as best we can. And so in health and wellness is the office in which I work. We offer mental health support. We have a suicide intervention program. We do alcohol and other drug education. We have an advocate. And then again, I do the prevention side. And then we have peer health educators. And then Kayena, and so our work is really focused on students primarily. We've dabbled a bit in supporting faculty and staff, but we're kind of moving back with that. And then Kayena will speak to her work with Safe Campus. Our Title IX office does a little bit of training. We're trying to help bolster them up to do more. And then our UW Police has like a self-defense class, essentially. And then there's a lot of academic departments and classrooms that are focusing on topics around sexual assault and interpersonal violence prevention. But honestly, we don't have a good sense of how much that's happening. So this is something I'm hoping to add into our climate survey the next time we do it, so we can get a better sense of what that looks like in the classroom. We would probably have somewhat of an understanding with the topic area like gender, women's sexuality studies, and then, of course, most importantly, we have our student-led activism. So we have so many students on campus who are putting on It's On Us campaign. They do Take Back the Night. They do anonymous survivor panels, film screenings. We have a really robust student activism community. Yeah, thank you. Sorry if I could address, thanks for holding on.
And if you're going to answer this later, it's totally fine to defer it. But I'm just curious, how do you get the Greek chapters and athletic teams to be required to do this? Because so much of what I hear on my campus is, well, we can only make so many things mandatory, so we can't make that mandatory.
Well, the athletic teams, that came from within their administration. And that only happened about 3 years ago. So that came from within. They made that decision. And it was kind of a slow rollout. With the Greek chapters, it's part of their recognition agreement with the university. So to be associated with the university, there is this agreement that they have to go through this training. And
And we're going to speak in a moment, too, about how you might set things up with that level of expectation for folks. That's part of the presentation we're going to get to in a minute here, is how you come in with an expectation of continued collaboration and relationship, too. So let me say briefly, our education for employees, mostly overall, I want to emphasize we don't have a comprehensive prevention plan for the university. There is required training. The majority of folks do not attend it. There is one-off training, and they can be provided by anyone. And so the landscape is really diverse, what folks get. But I just want to highlight, too, this idea that we have a role with staff and faculty at university campuses. A lot of folks haven't moved into that space or thought about it, and I want to challenge you that it is an incredibly exciting arena to work in, that there's a lot of inroads there with powerful folks in terms of like engagement and passion around this topic that you can capitalize on to really support students, right? They are the folks who are consistent on your campuses and are present. And so if you're thinking about comprehensive prevention on campuses, really think about this arena and what you need to do to build up that piece as well. I'm one of the primary providers for that education on our campus, but again, it's not comprehensive right now. It's kind of diverse what folks receive. So what we want to start thinking about a little bit is kind of this idea of how we're going to build those partnerships, like you were asking about, and how we really do that work. And so for us, this comes to a foundation of community, right? And many of us have kind of, similar definitions of community, but the definition we're going to stand on initially today is a group of people with diverse characteristics who are linked by social ties, share common perspectives, and engage in joint action in geographical locations or settings. And this is a public health definition of community, and obviously this is not inclusive of everyone. And the reason we want to talk about this a little bit is often when folks say community, they use it in a really broad term, right? So a lot of times at UW, folks say, we are a campus community, like we're all buddies, right? And they're really not acknowledging the diversity of the folks within this huge community of over 100,000 people. And so we find that when we say community, it often doesn't kind of translate well. It doesn't mean what we mean by it. And so what we've started to do at UW is use a different framing. And that's this idea of a micro community. And this is the language we now use. And so when we talk about micro communities, what we're talking about is taking your microscope and focusing it down, right? And this is this kind of scale on which we now do our education. And we have to be able to kind of communicate out about this, about why. So what this means is that a lot of education we do, let's say we are going to work with an athletic team. We think of our group of athletes at UW, 650 folks. But within that, we think of the rowing team. And within the rowing team, we think of our male and female teams, right? And then within that, we think of first-year women rowers versus second-year, third-year, right? And so when we go down to that micro level of what your most intimate kind of connections are with each other, you can really specifically tailor your training. But it is hard to justify this micro level, right? Folks will come in and say, just train all the athletes. And we have to say, that's not going to work. And the reason it doesn't work is that folks on the track team don't communicate with each other the same ways they do on the rowing team. Relationships are different. And most importantly at UW, power differentials are different, right? We're an institution of higher ed, and power plays a role in so many of these communities, whether that be an athletic community or staff and faculty community. Similarly, we had a request last year to go in and train our biostatistics department. And as we started to have conversations and talk to them about what they wanted some bystander education, we recognized that there were some pretty entrenched power differentials in that community. And we learned that the grad students did not in any way, shape, or form want to have a training with the faculty. They felt incredibly unsafe doing that, right? So we realized that even in this kind of small program at UW, we had to make sure that we tailored our training to 3 communities. So we instead went in and did a training for the grad students, the staff, who also didn't feel safe with the faculty, and the faculty, right? And then we said in these communities, we reached out to individuals each and said, what is happening for you? What does power feel like in your community? What do you have access to and what don't you, right? How do we need to tailor what we are doing to your specific needs? How does what we offer, how does our messaging need to be different for you? And another really important thing to point out here is that some folks don't feel connected to any community. Right? And so we recognize that's an underserved population as well. And when we say micro-community, the tendency can be to think that those communities are really homogenous, but we want to acknowledge the intersectionality that still exists in any micro-community, right? So you always are bringing that intersectional lens to any micro-community, and you're also bringing that trauma-informed lens. Because we acknowledge that folks in that community may have experienced trauma individually, but at our institution, what we have found is that when there's an individual experience of trauma, it is a group experience of trauma, right? When something happens to a member of the rowing team, everyone knows about it. It becomes public in our community and is made aware. And so we have to be cued into that information. We have to be intersectional about who's in the room, informed of what trauma that group may have experienced individually or together in order to do our best with the training. And so we want you to kind of consider this micro community lens. In a little bit, we're going to give you the opportunity to think more about it.
So many of you are probably familiar with a version of this community development model. We're using the one that was adapted by our state coalition, Washington Coalition of Sexual Assault Programs. And this model really upends and challenges and busts open the sort of colonial approach to education, whereby the all-knowing teacher and maybe white educator goes into a community and imparts their vast knowledge on sort of students who have no idea. And so it really challenges that and thinks of the community members as co-creators of knowledge, as experts of their own experiences, as people who, for which this work would not be, we would not be able to do this work if it were not for that community, within that community. So it kind of starts with this like stakeholder engagement. And stakeholder, again, I mean, I feel like there's a lot of different words we can use for that. That feels sometimes a little funny too. So that's sort of maybe your main contact, the person in the organization who requested the training. That could be a student leader. That could be your, another term we'll use is like your partner in prevention, your contact, like your new bestie, you know, whoever sort of is this person or people who you're developing a relationship with. That's sort of your key partner. And then as Kiana and I, as we get to the adaptation section, we're really using this community development model on a micro scale for every single training we do. And we really want to highlight the importance of, as we work with our partner in prevention, we're going through this like assessment of like, okay, what are the underlying conditions, what's going on in this community, what's happening there. We make a plan for how we want to adapt that particular training and then figure out how we're going to assess it. And so we're using this model, and we hope that this is another way to help make all of the invisible work more visible. And then again, as we said, our partnerships. Like, you know, I have been at the university now for a while, for about 10 years, and I feel like that the relationships I built are the reason why I have been effective in ways, and then not always effective. And so it's really about sustaining those relationships, and how can we come to these relationships from a place of honesty and transparency and building trust and really thinking of this as a very true partnership in this sense. And I can think of groups on campus who we have amazing relationships with, and things are just rolling and we're doing our work together. And folks where things was really great for a while, and then maybe that relationship dropped off, and I'm sort of left wondering what happened, and I can think of a few examples myself now. And then there's folks where that relationship is very challenging, and where we have to probably have some honest conversations about that. And so prioritizing this real sense of trust and transparency in relationships will lead us to better results for the community. And so Kiana's going to give an example. These are some, in a minute, these are some just sort of lessons learned and recommendations for us in our work at UW and how we found building relationships effective. So I'll focus on 3 right now. This one that really resonates for me is this listening closely to the needs and assets of a community. So again, being careful to not always come from this deficits-based approach or approach, no one wants to go to a training and feel you know, that they're, I mean, you know, we want to challenge folks, but we also want to help empower folks and help them see the good, positive work that they could be doing, or that the tools that they have access to if they wanted to employ or sort of use them. And then connecting to other work and showing up and support and sort of building capacity for them. So we know that, say we do a one-time training, what can we do to help set them up to carry the work forward? What else do they need from us? How can we be of service to them, whether that's resources or a toolkit, or they want to be connected. I do a lot of connecting of student groups to each other. There's a lot of like new student groups that are always popping up, and so I'm like, hey, have you talked to this group, to really make sure that we're helping them network. And then the sustaining piece. Sustaining is huge. And I find like coming from that place of having a relationship first, before, in addition to sort of talking about business or the work that you have to do together. And I think it's just not taking it for granted, like recognizing that that is a constant thing we have to do and maintain and prioritize that in our day-to-day.
And in some ways, I want to go back to your question here too about like how do we engage in a different way with folks. Think about how you set this up at the outset with someone when they reach out for a training and you say, you know, I would love to partner with your group. Yeah, I would love to have a conversation about what's going on for your community. Right? Don't say you're going to give them a training. Keep it like in your back pocket. Right? Be like, this is what I do first. And then I'll give you this, right? So it's how you set things up. And you kind of change expectations for what your work is on campus. You set it up as these are, you know, I have kind of a standard email even set up, but this is what I do before I come into community and do a training. This is my expectation for what interaction we'll have. Let's talk about that. So that's a powerful thing to do too, when you're thinking about how do you work in a different way with communities when historically it's maybe not been that way. And so I want to share a really exciting example for me of this at UW, which is that, again, I train staff and faculty a lot. We also have large medical facilities at UW, which is an interesting dynamic, right? And so I had to reach out from UW Dermatology, and they reached out and they said, we would like a training about preventing violence. And I was like, okay, like let me hear some more about that. Like, what are you asking for? And I learned very quickly that this training was coming straight from the resident director, Dr. Roy Colvin. And he said, I would like to know how to support my residents when they experience sexual harassment. I said, well, that's really like a unique ask. Like, why are you specifically asking about that? He said, well, my residents, they are actually placed in the VA clinic in town, and they are harassed all day, and they are isolated, and my staff, we don't know what to do. We don't know how to support them. We don't know what they want, and they don't know what to do. It's really tricky when you're with a patient, right? And we're trying to negotiate that power imbalance of doctor and patient, and yet the patient is the one harassing my residents. And I know that this is a pretty extreme problem for folks, and the harassment has been pretty severe. I said, you know, I'm so glad you shared that with me. Let's really talk about what's working well for your folks. Like, what are you doing now? And he said, well, I think we have set up that people can share. People are disclosing to us, so that's set up. We just don't know how to intervene in the moment, and we don't know how to help them afterward, and we don't know how to prevent it from happening in the first place. I said, those are such great conversations. How do we want to have this conversation, right? And so then we talked a lot about what information they most needed and how to make sure that our discussion with that group was centered on exactly the situations they were experiencing. And I talked to the residents separately, and I said, what do you want? Do you want the faculty and staff in there, or do you not? And they said, we do want them in there. We want them to hear what we're saying, and we want them to know that we need them to have our back, because right now they don't. They don't show up for us. They will stand in a room and see me being harassed, and they just stand there, and that's a horrible feeling, but we're ready to kind of talk to them about that. I said, okay, you're ready? So we had this amazing conversation beforehand, completely changed what the intention was of our time together. I also, part of that conversation for me was, what are you gonna do next? I am not coming to do this as a one-time training for y'all. I wanna hear how this work is gonna go forward. How are you gonna discuss it more? So setting up this really beautiful relationship with Dr. Colvin that has longevity and has really met the specific needs of his community. And that's the difference in framing it as a partnership and a relationship and really tying back into the assets of what is working well and kind of coming from that place as well. So what we would like you all to do now is think about a micro community that you hope to partner with. And in that micro community, why that community, right? Why those folks? Why does it make it exciting to think about partnering with them? And how would you identify your potential partner in that community? Do you know who they are? Who do you think they might be? And then how would you go about starting to build that relationship and trust? Okay, so what I want you to do is go back to your pairs, and as you're able and feel able to be present with us today, please engage with each other, make sure no one gets left out as much as possible, and talk for about 3-4 minutes about what micro community you would love to reach out to and how would you connect with them. And then we'll come back. Thanks, everyone. Thank you all for engaging so beautifully with each other. So today we're going to just keep those conversations to your parent chairs because we want you to keep having really great space there. We're not going to do large group debriefs, but we really encourage you to connect with each other and if you want to discuss more out of here. So we're going to go ahead and move on.
Okay, so the next section is really where we're going to share this toolkit of how we've been adapting the trainings that we've been doing. And so again, with myself serving students primarily and Kayana serving faculty and staff primarily, we obviously work together quite a bit. We both realized that we had been undergoing our own versions of adapting content and training, and we were asking kind of similar questions that sort of just formed organically. And so we decided to actually take the work that we were doing and start to document it a little bit and put it into a system so that we can use it. And it's kind of nice to sometimes take a step back from the work you're doing and just sort of name it and, again, create a system around it to then be used in sort of different settings. So we're going to share that toolkit for you. And we also found that a lot of the way we were adapting things, of course, fit quite nicely into our favorite principles of prevention. So for those who aren't from, the principles of prevention was based on a review approach to about 4 different topic areas, where they looked at what was effective around substance use prevention, school delinquency, violence prevention, risky sexual behaviors, and they really found these are the main principles that made those prevention programs effective. And it's often like the more I read research around what is working or promising or not working, almost sometimes the more confused I get as to how to apply that research. And again, I think as the evidence base in our field is still building, I find these principles to be something to always go back to. Because even when we start to have our gold standards of research, evidence-based programs someday, we're still going to have to adapt those for our communities because there is no one-size-fits-all. So even when we have these super amazing evidence-based practices, we're still going to have to adapt. So we have found these principles to help us, again, set our standards for education and what's working. So we are going to go through each principle and share with you some of the questions that we ask and that we use to engage with our partner in prevention, our key contact, as we do that kind of assessment before a one-time training. And just sort of logistically, we have all of these questions. Both of us sort of have all these questions kind of in a document that we use when we meet with somebody. So we may chat with them over the phone, we may meet in person, we may do that more than once. And it's a very fluid process, as you can imagine, as you have a conversation with somebody. So a lot of times we might just start out with the basic question of, tell me a little bit about your organization or your club or your team or your chapter. Why do you want this training? So often you just kind of start with this sort of like, hey, let's get to know each other, why are we having this training right now? And that can also help you even answer a lot of these other questions. So again, it's a real kind of fluid process. So we think it's important to, again, with the principle of prevention around being comprehensive. So making sure that programs are using multiple modalities, reaching students in multiple different contexts, different methods, that we're addressing a variety of factors that may be underlying causes as well as needs and assets. And so it's helpful just to know, like, what else is your organization or club getting? Like, do you have a comprehensive plan? Are you doing anything else? Or is this the first time that you've ever had any sort of training around this particular topic? And so that's really helpful for us to kind of have an understanding of how this fits within their own, again, organization. And then the sufficient dosage. So we all know, unfortunately, of course, that the one-time training does not have long-lasting effects. And so I don't know about you all, but I actually even just got an email this week saying, oh, can you come in and do 15 minutes and give us a training on consent, bystander, resources, and how to support survivor? So, I feel like we also have to be respectful, of course, of any community organization and how much time they have and how this fits into what they're doing. And so it's an opportunity to just sort of discuss dosage and the importance of time. Like, time is sort of our dosage in prevention, that the more time you can allow for something, and how sometimes throwing the kitchen sink, throwing every discussion into one training is not going to be effective. So we're kind of having a discussion about dosage. And then the appropriately timed in development. And again, some of these questions, of course, roll into each other and roll into other principles of prevention. So again, it's very kind of fluid, but It's helpful for us to know sort of the makeup of the group, their developmental level. Are we talking about first-year students? Are they coming from areas where they've had access to education or not? And even just generally, sort of what is this particular organization kind of all about? What is the main sort of characteristics that define them? What is really defining this community? Is this a queer and trans-focused student club? Is this students of color who are from migrant worker families? Is this the track and field team? Is, who, and sort of what sort of intersectional identities kind of make up that group? And then I think on the staff side too, it's this, how long have folks been part of the university? So at UW, we have people who've been there for like 30 years and people who, are new to the community. And then well-trained implementers. So we know the messenger really matters a lot in delivering trainings. And sometimes we have this weird thing around people don't necessarily think our profession's a profession or that it can just sort of be done by anyone. And at the same time, we know how important it is to have that education come from people who are from within that community. And so how do we partner and see who the best messenger really is? Like who can increase buy-in? Who, is it staff, is it students, is it a combination? Who can we partner with as trainers? Who is really an effective kind of opinion leader in that space? So I'm gonna give an example of our men's and women's rowing team and sort of the work that I did with them. I wanna make sure that I have my notes on this over the last year. So it's worth just giving a real quick history. In both of these teams, there's a men's team and a women's team. On the men's team, there are two female-identified folks who serve as coxswains. And these teams compete separately, but they also socialize together and they also practice together. And in 2016, the women's team, their long-standing coach was fired for mistreatment and creating an unsafe environment for the students. And he was a very long-standing coach. These are obviously very public situations. And then in 2017, there was a situation where two male rowers filmed a sexual assault of a woman rower and while she was blacked out. And that footage for that particular sexual assault was spread around to different students on these teams. However, the survivor of the sexual assault didn't know about it for a few months. And so there was something that a lot of people knew about, but no one said anything about. Those male students, once the survivor found out what had happened, she ended up kind of going forward with some reporting process both through the university as well as criminally. And the male students were then kicked off the team and out of UW. And so when this all happened, the men's rowing team decided they needed to make a change and that they had a real kind of cultural issue on their hands. And so then I had actually worked with these teams before, so I'd had a relationship with them already. And so then we started to work together and plan their comprehensive education program for the following year, which was last year. And we met over the course of a month ahead of the trainings that we provided. And so I met with this really amazing group of student leaders on both teams, on coaches from both teams, not the head coaches, but other like really influential coaches, and actually coaches who even had training and expertise in this area as well, which was an incredible collaboration. And we really worked very hard to help really define sort of what these programs could be. And so they knew they wanted to do a comprehensive education, like life skills approach. So they wanted to, over the course of the whole year, plan programs for these students pretty much weekly. And at least in the fall, they designed something that was weekly. So already they came in with this understanding of we need to be more comprehensive. We can't just do a one-time training and call it done. So they were already kind of in that space of being really comprehensive. Then we had to talk about dosage, so like how much time and what are the main things we really wanted to focus on, and then also how to make that at the right developmental level. So they ended up doing all these different configurations. So we did a training for the men's varsity, we did a training for first year and men and first year women together. We did a training for just the women's team, and we really they decided, of course, as they know best, how those different, how they wanted to break up the different groups. And so we again really looked at sort of how to meet them at that need, especially with the first year students coming in. They had not been a part of this situation that had been going on, but they're coming into this community where they have some significant group trauma, survivor trauma, as well as then figuring out what does this mean for both of our teams. And then we really talked a lot about the messenger and the implementation. So who is going to facilitate this, and how do we find those correct partnerships? So we worked with, there were a number of student leaders who actually participated in delivering the training. They shared their personal connections, why they thought it was important, why they want to change the culture of their team, why they want to be honest about it. And then I also had a student who actually ended up facilitating with me. And so these students actually came up with a scenario, like they came up with all the scenarios that we used. We did like one training around relationships, consent, and boundaries, and one training on bystander behaviors and intervention. And so they came up with all the scenarios for both of those, and even a few of the students ended up facilitating. So I worked really closely with them to help them figure out how do they get comfortable to facilitate, and what can they then bring to the table. And they were really incredible in really stepping up as facilitators, even though they hadn't necessarily sort of done that before. And we also worked hard to make sure the head coaches were on board and also really set the stage and the tone. And that was so important. I find that so important working with athletic teams, that those coaches come in from a very genuine place of why this matters. And often we always have a lot of discussions too, should coaches be in the room or not be in the room? And in this instance for that community, they actually felt it was important for the coaches to be in the room. And students said that as well, because they wanted to see their coaches engaging, and they wanted their coaches to know about some of the other things that had been going on. And so again, because of the things that these teams had then been through, we had to leave a lot of space for discussion and provide a lot of care and support kind of ongoing for that team. And so we're actually starting to get together now again to sort of plan what this might look like in year 2. So I haven't heard from them in a little bit, so I'll be really interested to see kind of where the team's at now and how sort of after a year of really comprehensive education that has sort of played out for them. And then one other really important, again, principle of prevention is being socio-culturally relevant, of course. And I think with understanding the norms and practices that are the underlying issues of sexual assault, and then again coming from that assets-based approach. And so how we found, to just start with like, what are the norms of your organization doesn't always necessarily get you the answer you need. It's like the water that we're swimming in. And so we found this actually effective to even just start off by saying sort of, what's the culture of your club or organization or team as far as like discussing topics of interpersonal violence or prevention and response? Like, where are you at with even having these discussions? And that can often elicit a lot of information about where they're at. What are relationships like among students and staff? What, if anything, is happening in the larger landscape? So even with working with gymnastics teams this past year, it was really important to know about the conversations they'd been having as a result of all the things that have been going on at Michigan State on the gymnastics teams and for the Olympic committees. And then what examples of scenarios are most relevant? We do a lot of work with students and faculty staff in having them help us write and edit the scenarios that we're using for, say, bystander intervention trainings in particular, because they're very scenario, very skills-based. And so it's not just that in a scenario you're changing like the name of the street that the situation is happening on. You're really having to go a lot deeper and also find the right people who can help write those scenarios. And so the scenarios, very relevant scenarios, are incredibly important.
Another thing that's especially important to us is understanding the relationships between folks. So this concept of supporting positive relationships is where we want to learn more about the assets of the community, right? What is working well and your inner dynamics between each other and your relationships. And then that kind of leads you to what isn't too, right? And this goes to, what do we expect the support system to look like if we're having this conversation, because there will then be disclosures, right? And we want to make sure we are keeping that on our forefront. We want to know, are there things we can build on? Well, this person is the person we all go to to, but they don't know, because we trust them and they're really kind, but they don't know any of the resources. So, okay, how do we make sure we provide extra support to that person? So asking about the relationships, and what's really important too is you might learn who is not trusted folks too. And you might recognize that there needs to be different information or reach out to that person as well. So this is a really key aspect. And one thing, a way I want to kind of think through this for you too, an example is when I worked with the biostats department, I was talking earlier about how we adapted it for those different communities. One really powerful thing I'm finding right now is to ask folks, like, what are you all talking about? Right? What is in the national news in your field, in your arena? And you can look at this for a lot of different folks and they'll say, oh yeah, there was this article or there was this thing that's happened and we are all talking about that. And so one example for biostats that was really relevant to them, and part of the reason they reached out for the training is that there was a major situation that y'all may have heard about where there was a really senior Google executive who was accused of pretty severe sexual harassment. And he happened to actually be a biostats faculty member at another institution. And everyone in the biostats department at UW knew him, right? It's a small field. They knew who he was. They'd been in conferences with him. They read his papers. They trusted him. They thought of him as a mentor, right? And so what I said was, okay, so where is this conversation happening for your community? And they said, well, there's these couple blog posts people have written. And I said, send me the blog post. I want to read what folks are saying. And they sent them to me. And what I quickly cued into and learned is that it's great to read a blog post where someone kind of discloses and shares because it gives you the context, but what is even more revealing is what are the commenters saying, right? So go to the comments on those posts, because on the comments, you very quickly got to see faculty members from across the nation putting their opinions about whether or not these folks should have ever disclosed the sexual harassment, how it was hurting this faculty member, how it couldn't have happened because it was so long ago, how even bringing it up was going to hurt all the women's careers who have ever worked with him. They'll all be tarnished, so why would this one woman do this, right? A lot of anger at the victim for coming forward. And then also in the comments, I saw people being like, what are you talking about? You can absolutely report sexual harassment whenever you want. People have the right to share and be safe. And so there were these two really different viewpoints in the comments. And what I did is I then worked with a graduate student. I said, this is what I found. How can we talk about this in your group, right? And so we actually put these blog posts up. And I said, I know you all have read these, but have you read the comments? How does it feel to see this comment from this person who you all know who works at a university in the Midwest? Right? That where he's saying, like, don't make a big deal, don't make a fuss. This shouldn't have been brought up. What does that feel like to you to know this is your peer? This is someone you looked up to. This is a mentor in the field. And then what does it feel like to see a peer who says, no, you should absolutely be able to disclose? And then the next place I took that to is this is your community, right? This broader community. And you are going to be the leaders in this community in a short period of time. And so how are you going to be a part of changing this culture? What are you going to do to make sure that this is not how your lab is run? To make sure that this is not how your conferences are, right? That folks are being harassed. What can you do? What conversations can you have among yourself now in this intimate community of UW, knowing that in a few years you're going to leave here, you're going to be leaders, you're going to be out among our nation, and you're going to be over so many folks, right? And we need to recognize this problem, and we need to think proactively about it instead of just being responsive. And so, when we started that conversation with them, they were like, yeah, I'm with you. And then when I put this blog post up, they were like, oh, yeah, you're actually talking about us. This is really, really about us. You're right. And they were so engaged. They were so present, and they were bought in. I mean, they were there. And so if you can work really intimately with someone to say, what is the conversation happening in your community? Where's that conversation coming from? What are instances you're talking about? And then use those as examples to talk about what's working well, what isn't in those situations. It's a really great way to kind of tie in folks and have that engagement. And again, this is the group that said that it's not safe for us to do this together, right? Because some of the very faculty here are doing this behavior as well. But what was interesting is when we were working with them, we were having concurrent sessions, and the grad students during the session started to raise their hands and say, wait, we need to know what you're doing in the other room right now. Tell me. I'm not sure if I can trust what's happening over there. And so we're like, absolutely, you get to know everything that they're doing, the faculty and staff are talking about. Because, they felt uncomfortable and scared, right? And so it's also about what information do folks need to know if there's a lot of power differentials? How do they need to know what's happening in those other spaces to make them feel safe? So this is just one example of how we really thought about, socioculturally what was happening for folks, what was the conversation of having, and how we kind of centered the training around that. So another thing for us is a sound theory of change, and this is something that's really on the leading edge of what we're doing at UW, and we wanted to bring it to you all, even though it's not fully done for us. But what this centers around is this idea that we know that there are different goals in any learning situation, right? We want to kind of talk about knowledge and attitudes, but we really want to see is a shift in behaviors and actions as well, right? And what we're doing now at UW is we're actually modifying the stages of change, the readiness for change scale, and figuring out how we can assess folks before they come to a training. And so what this is it's stages that tell you, is someone in pre-contemplation, contemplation, or readiness for action, right? So how do we use that information about how ready they are to learn to change what we do? So for example, pre-contemplation person would have never even thought about it. They would think sexual harassment isn't even a problem, sexual assault isn't even a problem, right? Whereas you have someone who's ready for action who's like, I know this is happening, I've already done some trainings, I listened to some webinars, like I want to have this conversation. And if you have both those folks in the same space, you need to be doing different things, right? So can you differentiate who's in the space? Can you make small breakout groups based on readiness? You can assess this beforehand with surveys that folks fill out. You can also assess it in the space, right? You are listening and keying into things that folks say. And so this is a really kind of an edge for us of figuring out, how do we meet folks where they're at and use that to catapult us into specific learning for those communities. And then also you're going to be assessing for potential resistance, right? What is resistance to having this conversation, to having this space for folks? Where does that resistance come from? Can we work with some folks directly beforehand who are resistant to it to kind of have them be on board or have them understand our intentions better? Is the resistance coming from a place of, our community doesn't talk to people outside our community, and what happens here stays here, right? And if that is a place that the resistance is coming from, which is very, very common for University of Washington, there's a history of departments taking care of their own problems for themselves, not taking care of them well, but taking care of the problems for themselves, then they might have a history of that, we don't trust the larger institution to be a part of this conversation with us. So how do we bridge that as well? So these are those questions we want you to kind of be assessing as you're working with your partner, maybe you're working with some other folks you're going to provide the education to, and also thinking about other ways you can get this information. And then we want you to think about lots of different activities that you're going to use with the group. You all know that, right? You want to do lots of interaction, different things. And then also your outcome evaluation. You all are already doing amazing outcome evaluations, but one key thing here is how do we actually communicate those results back to the group? This is not something that's just typically done in our field. We usually might give them back to our funders. We might give them back to our partner. But how do you make a plan that everyone in the training gets to know the outcome of the training? Right? Think about what that says to someone. If they dedicate their time to that space and they say like, oh, my whole community moved this far on this concept or this idea, or wow, look, people are saying they're really ready to engage in different action. How powerful is that? So how do we also provide outcomes back to the group? So to bring this all kind of together for you all a little, some of the ways we put this into action within the curriculum adaptation itself, you've heard us saying this throughout in different examples, is that we're really talking about the micro-community relevance, right, that focusing in. How do we adapt case scenarios, right? How do we work with folks in the community to actually write those? And to talk about what kind of goals they have for the outcomes of those case scenarios. How do we share facts and very pertinent only local statistics for a community when that is powerful? Something I want to mention is that we are at a large research institution. And so I know I've heard echoed here in many different sessions to never use statistics, but I just want to caveat that for some folks I specifically work with in a staff and faculty research institution, one of them is in the room right now, they want to know what is happening for our community. They want the statistics. They want to be able to use that because for them it's powerful information to catapult change in their communities. So work with the community and ask, do you want statistics? Do you not? How do you intend to use those? And then make sure it is the exact statistics they need, right? Again, these are not thrown up on a slide and not utilized, but think about how you utilize them in a thoughtful way. And then the blogs like we were talking about, and then make sure you really reflect on assets in the community during your session and time with folks. How do you allow them space to talk about the assets they have, how they're going to build on those, how those are incredible seeds for change, right? And then positive community norming. So how are you creating space in the room for reassessing and setting new norms? One way we do this at UW is that we do online polling during our trainings. So we use Poll Everywhere. There's one of the options that are out there. And that goes up on our screen, and we have different questions we're asking, and folks get to real-time anonymously answer that during the training, and then everyone in the room gets to see their responses. And it is so, so powerful, right? One of the questions I often ask for different communities is, do you feel like violence can be prevented? And, we do it at the very beginning, and then we do it at the end, and folks get to see that change. Do you feel like you have a role to play in creating a safer community here? And the whole community says yes, right? And what that says is, hey, my peers are in this with me. We have kind of committed to do this together. I don't have to feel isolated alone anymore. So that positive community norming can be really powerful as well.
Just to add one thing to that, again, back to my men's and women's rowing team example, this was very important for them, for the students. They wanted this discussion to be out and about and very visible. They didn't want even like small group, they wanted it all to be in the room because they needed to really make that very visible, what people would commit to do, say they came across a situation that was like concerning or and so that was really important for them. It may not, and again, maybe groups are not ready to go there yet. And so kind of, again, depends where anyone is at in sort of their own readiness.
So what we would like for y'all to do now is to go back to your pairs and work with your pair again for a few moments and think about that micro community you identified. And now think about what adaptation questions do you need to ask of that community. So what do you need to learn, and how would you ask that of the community? So if you've identified, I work with the custodial staff at the University of Washington. So I might think, what do I need to know about their work times? What do I need to know about how they work? What do I need to know about how they perceive their environment to be, whether it's safe or not, right? Melissa talked about the athletic teams, right? Like, what does she need to know about an athletic team to adapt a training? So what we want you to do is work with your pair, work on this question for a few moments, and then we'll come back. And again, we won't be doing a large group share out, so if that changes what you're able to share in the pair, know that. We'll have about 3-4 minutes, and then we'll come back. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, so the final section of our presentation is really about this assessment piece. And so we're speaking specifically about how are we assessing our partnerships and how are we assessing the adaptation specifically. So we expect that you will be doing your normal gig around pre-post test, program evaluations, climate surveys, like the normal way that you assess whether your programs are meeting their learning objectives. And so we're offering you kind of how we're thinking about doing this. And again, I think if we're going to really try to understand how much adaptation makes a difference, we have to really focus on that. So these are a few questions that we are starting to include in our program evaluations, where we're really trying to get and have a better understanding, both from the micro community perspective, was your community represented, and also from their own specific identity perspective. How much was your identity represented in this training? And then what components have most enabled you to sort of connect? So we find that the qualitative responses for this are going to be, at least initially for us, are going to be a lot more effective than sort of quantitatively trying to assess this. So we really want to know those specific examples of how they connected or didn't connect. And if we find that folks are saying that their identities were not represented in the training, then we really need to make a change. And we really need to do better, and we need to really examine that specifically. We also think about, again, like how can we get this information creatively? So maybe, that's in our evaluation, because we already, ask a lot of questions. Maybe that's saying, hey, if any students would stay after a training to chat with us. This also could be done in like a follow-up discussion with our sort of key partner or key students who were interested in that group. Sometimes you have students after a training who are like, how do I get involved or what do I do? And maybe this is one way, is they can provide some really specific feedback. So again, getting creative for what works for you as far as timing. But again, if we're going to prioritize adaptation, we also need to show the justification for why it really matters. And so we think assessment is one way to do that.
And I want to share an example of this that I did at UW, which is that I had a reach out from the Herring Center, which is part of our experimental education unit at UW, that they wanted training for their student staff. So these are folks who have a dual role at the university, which always makes things good and complicated, right? They're students and they're employees. They're under two different sets of obligations. And they wanted support for these folks who were going to be coming in and working with families in the experimental education unit, primarily who had children who were on the autism spectrum. And what they shared with me is that historically in that program, there was a lot of sexual harassment and harassment from families towards the teachers, in addition to peer-on-peer harassment that was happening. And so they were trying to think constructively about how they could prevent that for the next year for their incoming cohort of about 70 to 80 folks who are coming in, who are going to be running these programs. And so I worked really extensively with some students and with the administrators to adapt the training to their specific setting, right? This idea of being in a classroom and experiencing harassment from someone else, from a parent, and how your co-teacher could intervene. This idea of a peer-on-peer harassment situation, really putting it in that setting. And then I worked really hard to really bring an intersectional lens to that and think about how the power shows up in that space, right? And this is very similar to the same experience of like a patient-doctor, where there is obvious power of teacher over parent, and yet if a parent gets to review a teacher, there's another type of power as well, right? So we have to think about that really constructively and think how that affects people's willingness to intervene and how it affects people's willingness to support their peers when they see something. That's really key to ask. So really asking about, like, you know, when harassment happens, how do folks feel about disclosing that? What are the things that keep them from disclosing? And a lot of it for UW comes back to this power differential. And so what we were able to do is really adapt the training, and then we were able to assess whether that adaptation worked. And I had some really great data afterward. Folks wrote really powerful stuff, and I wanted to share that with you. So one person wrote, as a woman of color, often on the lower end of the power dynamic in working relationships, I particularly appreciate the emphasis in your presentation on how the levels of privilege can affect harassment. I left the presentation feeling like a culture of safety had been established with everyone in the room, and the experiences brought us together. So I can retire on that statement, right?
Done.
Like, I was really excited. I was really excited to hear that for someone, the training connected with them, with the setting that they were going to be in, right? Other folks wrote, it was great detailed information about relevant obstacles, right? We really identified what the real obstacles were for them in being a part of the solution and intervening. I appreciate the statistics and examples of harassment in the education workplace. I worked with the students to learn what they were talking about. There had been some major instances across the nation that we reflected on, as well as provide concrete strategies to use as both a victim and a bystander, right? So when you do your post-evaluation, if you ask for this sort of reflection, you'll get to key into, is this working, right? Has the adaptation itself worked? Because we want to know if it is, and if it's not, we know that we need to adjust things. Because if we want to do really relevant trainings, we know they have to be adapted, but we haven't been asking the question of whether that's working. So this is one way to see that in action. And then the actual assessing of the partnership. This is another stage of something that we often don't do, we don't think about. It's that invisible work, right? So how do we go back to our partner and we say, has trust been built, right? How do they feel about our working relationship? How did the training go for you? Are they utilizing our resource afterward? Have they changed in the culture of that micro community? Are folks more likely to consult with resources? And then what is your plan for continued education, right? What are you doing next? How are you taking this forward? What are the next steps? And how do we maintain and sustain this relationship, which is incredibly important. And then as I keyed into earlier, how are we working together to provide feedback and assessment and follow-up for this entire community, and in that have action steps for what folks can do next, right? So what does your kind of bringing it all back to the community look like? And I want to bring it back to kind of some of the stuff we were saying at the beginning, is that this is a lot of the invisible work, right? But it is so important that we key into this and we think about how it is something we need to acknowledge and make sure that other folks see as well.
So one example of assessing partnerships, which I'm not going to lie, can be a difficult and challenging process as well as sort of rewarding. And so as I mentioned, I oversee a peer health educator program at UW. And so one thing that we've been working towards is building in these liaison positions in our peer health educator program, so that we have students who are trained as peer health educators who also sit on student leadership boards in all these communities around campus. So working with our CUE Center, our Ethnic Culture Center, our Disability Resource Center, our International Student Center, with first year programs with Residence Life. And so the first liaison position that we've built was one with the Greek community. And that was actually out of convenience because we had a peer health educator who was also part of the Greek community, who had also been involved in a lot of activism and who basically founded this group, this student-run group called Greeks Take Action. So a peer health educator in our office was part of this Greeks Take Action. And so it was really kind of an easy in to really sort of establishing this strong partnership. So we have this position that's paid for out of our office. The student sits on the leadership board of this organization. And every year, twice a year, we get together and we assess our partnership. And so at the beginning of every fall quarter, we really talk about what are the expectations for the position this year, how can this person both bring peer health educator programming to the Greek community, and then how do they take what's happening in all these different diverse Greek chapters and bring it back to inform the work that we're doing in sort of the health promotion phase. And so that person is really that liaison, of course, in both worlds. And so the beginning of every quarter, we really sit down with all the students and discuss what are the needs this year, what are your plans, how can our peer health educator position support this work. And then at the end of every school year, as we're thinking about rehiring this position, because we have a new student every year, this is the third year that we've done it, we have that conversation at the end of every year as well. So, and we're obviously kind of checking in along the way. Because this position too as a liaison is a little bit squishy, and we've had to really put some boundaries around that. And so that's kind of also forced us to have those discussions too, but we have this natural cycle of having to assess this partnership, because I'm gonna be hiring a student, so I still need to know, is it gonna work? How are things going in the Greeks Take Action organization? Because if the Greeks Take Action organization one day dissolves, then there goes that liaison position for us. So we would then have to find another way to do that, or we would focus on a different group. And so again, we sort of have this built-in natural cycle that really forces us. And so then also when things have come up throughout the year that have been challenging or difficult, like for example, when we would host open trainings around campus for any student to attend, a lot of the fraternities would mandate or make their members go to a training. So of a training of 60 students, we'd have half 30 from one particular chapter, and that started to create not a great dynamic for folks. So we had to have some hard conversations with our Greek community around putting some boundaries around how that was going to work. And I think because we had this trust and relationship and partnership built, we were able to have those conversations a lot more, and they really understood. And so again, we're always assessing that to see how it's working. And so the final piece for you all, I think to really kind of we'll just do 2 minutes, I think, in pairs again, and really think about, maybe choose one of these that kind of resonates with you most. How will you either assess the adaptation specifically and know that it made a difference, or do you have more energy around how will you assess the strength of your partnership? How would you know if trust has been built? So take about 2 minutes in your pair and share and discuss that again.
Hopefully you all will get to have beautiful further conversations on this, right? This is not the end all be all 90 minutes. As you all know, one time doesn't work. So we want to bring you back to this goal, right? And we want to remind you that the key for this is that you take the time to document what you are doing so that we make the invisible visible, right? As preventionists, we want our work to be acknowledged, we want it to be seen, and most of all, we want it to be funded, right? So think about how we're gonna do that as a community and individuals. So take what we've talked about today, this idea of adaptation and how key it is to your work and how you justify that time and how you might have to step away from other things to do that, so.
And we wouldn't be advocates or preventionists if we didn't leave you with just a hopeful quote to read for yourself and take from that quote whatever works for you in the moment.
We can read it out too if it's small for folks in the back. So, hope is not blind optimism. It is not ignoring the enormity of the task ahead or the roadblocks that stand in our path. It's not sitting on the sidelines or shirking from a fight. Hope is that thing inside of us that insists, despite all evidence to the contrary, that something better awaits us if we have the courage to reach for it and to work for it and to fight for it. I think we have maybe a few minutes for maybe 1 or 2 questions. If folks have any that are on your mind, we can absolutely stick
We're happy
around
to
and
stay, yeah.
please reach out to us. We would love to build our community. So let me bring the mic back for a question back here.
I just have a question about how you make decisions about dosage. So when you kind of say yes and when do you say no? So your example really stood out about getting 30 minutes for 5 topics with the freshman class. So at what point do you say that's better than nothing, and at what point do you say that's not enough?
It's such a great question. I think you need to have backing to be able to say no and keep that consistent. So I do think I'm again part of a larger team. So if I can't just make this decision really in isolation, because as a department, we kind of have to make that together. So a lot of times I'm, again, not making that in isolation. And then I need backing from my supervisor, from everybody to say, this is why we're saying no. And when I've talked to other colleagues around the country, there are people who are saying, I'm not doing anything less than a 2-hour training. So there are people who are doing that. And so I think, again, if we're going to be effective, we have to put some boundaries and strategies around what is going to be most effective and explain why.
One thing I've been doing for folks who reach out to me, staff and faculty, is instead I say, let me send you some brochures and 5 talking points. If you're only going to give 10 minutes, I want you to do it. And I have a phone conversation with them, and I help them facilitate a 10-minute conversation about our resource, when to use it, and what people's rights are. So I kind of put that onto them, and I say, but I would love to partner with you in the future and do something more comprehensive. Let's talk about when you have time for that. So I still give them something, but I'm not going to go out and offer a 10-minute thing. Great question. Maybe one more question. We have 1 minute left.
Other questions?
All right,
Okay,
thanks
thank you all.
everyone.
Take care.
Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to this Prevent Connect podcast. Prevent Connect is a project of the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, with funding from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views presented on Prevent Connect are not necessarily the views of the United States government, the CDC, or CalCASA. To learn more about Prevent Connect, visit www.preventconnect.org. For more information about CalCASA's mission, or to show your support, visit calcasa.org. That's CalCasa.org.